Evening, everyone, and good morning to those who are joining from overseas. Um, Welcome to Voice of India Academy book review presentation series. I'm your host, Lakshmi Prasad. I've been associated with Voice of India Academy for a few years now. As you know, Voice of India Academy is a group of history enthusiasts who are aligned with Sri Sitaram Goelji's school of thought, and we've been involved in hosting authors, doing book reviews, hosting book review presentations, etc., and also helping research scholars who are doing history research from our school of thought, helping them with financial assistance, etc., and academic assistance, etc., and also distributing Voice of India books throughout various libraries in India. Today we have with us our esteemed guests, Sri Probal Chowdhury ji and Sri Pramod Kumar ji. We had them earlier previously for a different book review. Today they're going to present to us a critical appraisal of Manu Pillai's Gods, Guns, and Missionaries. And it has a subtitle which reads The Making of Modern Hindu Identity. Quite interesting and evocative title. Um, and then, as you are aware, this book has been widely popular, and the author has been invited by various media houses for interviews, etc. But I think this review is going to uncover a lot that has not been covered in those interviews. And from a Dharmic point of view, what are our observations, objections, etc., will all be covered in this review. Just to give you an introduction to our authors, for those who already don't know them, Sri Probal Chowdhury ji is professor, Department of English, Sister Nivedita University, Kolkata. He's been in academia since 2006 with extensive experience in teaching, research, and consultancy. Recipient of prestigious accolades including the Azad Fellowship and Motwani Jadeja Foundation Book Grant. Member of NCERT's textbook development team for social science, aligned with NEP and NCFSE. Shri Pramod Kumar ji is from Amrita Darshanam International Center for Cultural Spiritual Studies, Amrita Vishwavidyapeetham, teaching Indian knowledge systems at Amrita University for over 2 decades, senior consultant for technical support group under NEP and CF implementation, member of NCERT's IKS Circular Area Group for Textbook Integration of Indian Knowledge Systems. So the format will be there will be a presentation by our guest today, followed by a Q&A. So over to you, sir. You can kick off with your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Lakshmi ji, our host, and to the Voice of India for inviting us again today. We are here for the second time, and we feel really happy, honored to be here again online with all of you. Now, let me begin with this, with a reference to an interview by a young historian, Indian historian. I am using the word historian with a sense of, anyway, Anirudh Kanisetti. So during the Jaipur Literature Festival, Jaipur Lit Fest in 2024, he gave an interview where he claimed himself a public historian, and he said that while academic writing of history should be based on hard facts, popular writing can blur the lines. So he calls himself a public historian, and he asserts this, and he goes on to say that one should imagine history as the word imagine within quotes, and he claims that it is a very reductive approach to advocate that one should be proud of one's own history. Very recently, another popular mythologist who has joined this contemporary coterie of public historians, he has also dared to rewrite the history of Indus Valley civilization, the Saraswati Sindhu civilization. While Indians, every Indian, in fact, all of us have a right to read, research, and write about Indian history, it does not absolve such self-appointed public historians from the rigors of writing history. Now, the term public historian was first coined in the United States in the late 1970s by Robert Kelly, a historian at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He introduced this term in 1976 when he established a graduate program for training historians for roles beyond the boundaries of academia. Now, the author of the book Under Scrutiny that we are talking about today, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries, Manu Pillai, belongs to this new school. And in our presentation today, we will try to examine and unravel some of the narratives which this young author tries to deploy to build his arguments, and that Hinduism is largely a Brahminical construct, and that modern Hindu nationalism is nothing but a fleeting reaction to Christian missionary excesses during the British colonial period. Now, you see, in India, we have had the good fortune on having a galaxy of great writers of history, historiographers, and historians during the entire period of the national movement, particularly in the first half of the 20th century and even following Indian independence. Sir Jadunath Sarkar, Ramesh Chandra Mazumdar, Sitaram Goelji, they were amongst the foremost genuine public historians of the 20th century. Sir Jadunath Sarkar was, in fact, educated in English literature, but such was the high impact of his historical writings that even A.L. Basham called him the greatest Indian historian of his generation. Sri Sitaram Goelji, on the other hand, single-handedly challenged the whole cabal of left-leaning historians in the 1980s by producing seminal works, original works, on the historical origins of the rift between Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. A whole generation of Hindus, all of us, in fact, were made aware of the historicity of sacred sites like the Janmabhoomi at Ayodhya because of his bold writings. Okay, today, because of this proliferation of digital content, we have been accustomed to an exploration of interest in Indian history, culture, civilization, and thousands of Indians are very eager, and they're eagerly lapping up historical content on social media on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, and tapping this huge market is a new generation of authors, as I was telling you, who have been writing on varied themes of Indian history under the sobriquet of public historians. And these are people who mainstream media, unfortunately, celebrates as individuals who speak truth to power. But unlike Sitaram Goelji, who was challenging the school of Marxist historiography, this new school of public historians are ironically the B team of the old Marxist school and are building their brand by claiming what they call, by debunking what they call the right-wing WhatsApp history. Pramodji, if you could take.
Thank you, Probal, for the introduction. So expanding on the thread that the introduction that Probal was giving, the point that we are trying to make is that this term called public historians had a very specific context and function and continues to have in Western academia. So it refers to historians who have the ability to bring history, which is confined to, say, a section of the scholarship, to the public domain to make it accessible to the public, to make it interesting to the public, to engage the public with different narratives of history. But we find that this group has, kind of assumed this title of being public historians. But the narratives of history which they are bringing into the public domain are problematic for many reasons. And in particular, in this case of Manu Pillai's book, we will see that it is largely colonial historiography which he is promoting in the 21st century, through his popular book, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries. So, the book starts with a chapter, an introduction to Hinduism, a very long introduction running into about 34 pages. And in fact, I was telling Lakshmi Prasad, our host, that the magazine where we published the review initially, it had a word limit of 3,000 words. And when we, the introduction was so problematic that by the time we finished the critiquing the introduction itself, we had crossed that word limit of 3,000 words. And therefore, you're saying that this is one of the longest reviews of a book that we have written in recent times, running into almost 7,000 words, which is like a journal paper. Reason being that, every page, every word, every paragraph, we find it to be very, very problematic. So this is one thing that we've highlighted here, is that his sources, on the basis of which he has developed this introduction to Hinduism, is largely colonial historians, colonial historiography, and Marxist historiography. So, from his bibliography and notes, I've just picked up 8 prominent names. And if you're a student of Indian history, you'll recognize many of these names, and you will know the kind of biased narratives that some of these historians have peddled in the name of writing Indian history. So, in fact, in the note, the author himself, is saying that I use the term national not in the sense of modern nationalism, but Brahminical ideology. So, this is the whole of the introduction. The author is trying to project Hinduism as a Brahminical construct. That what we know as Hinduism today was entirely born of the imagination of one particular community called the Brahmins, and that they created a social hierarchy, a structure in which they put themselves at the top of this hierarchy and kept the rest of the society under a stranglehold, which is the typical narrative that you see, which started during the colonial period, especially after the East India Company, etc., took political control over India, and the British became our masters. So this is the same historiography which the author seems to be promoting through the book. So what we find problematic and what we have highlighted is that in this entire long introduction, you do not have any single reference to the source texts of Hinduism, whether it's from the Rig Veda down to, say, the Dharmashastras, or to even regional texts in Indian languages. You will not find a single original reference to any Sanskrit text or the real sources of Hinduism. So this is a question that we have raised in critiquing this introduction. Imagine, let's say, you're writing the history of Judaism, and you don't know a word of Hebrew or Aramaic, and you're writing the history of, say, Judaism in Europe based on the literature produced by Hitler and the Nazis during the Second World War. You're basing your entire introduction to the Jewish people and to the community based on sources which were hostile to them, which were trying to project the Jews as the source of all the problems in Europe. So, what kind of introduction would that be? Or let's say if you're writing an introduction to Islam today, and you don't know a word of Arabic, and you don't go to the source texts, whether it is the Quran or the Hadiths, but you are writing your introduction of Islam based on those who are very critical of Islam. Uh, so this is the kind of introduction that he gives to us about Hinduism, largely based on the views of Marxist and colonial historians. So if this idea of Brahminical Hinduism, we know that this word called Brahmanism was itself coined, by the British historians and the British officers to project this, a kind of a biased image of Hinduism being under the control of the upper caste, etc. So we have quoted two scholars on our side. This is a well-known narrative which has been exposed by our scholars. So Dr. David Frawley says that the term Brahmanism is a colonial distortion for Vedic Hinduism. Vedic texts back to Rigveda honor rishis, kings, great merchants, and those who cultivate the land. Vedic Hinduism is a dharma for all human beings and extends to the entire universe with the cosmic Purusha. Similarly, Aravind Nilakandan, in his very beautiful Dharmic social history of India, says, according to colonial historiography, Brahmanism worked through the collusion of Brahmins, considered hereditary priests, and Kshatriyas, the ruler class. In this view, all the spiritual philosophical richness of Hindu Dharma was considered sophistry with no innate value, invented by the dominant classes, Brahmins and Kshatriyas, to support their socially vested interests. So, this is exactly what Manu Pillai says in the introduction on page 19, which I've quoted here. He says the Kshatriya does not flourish without the Brahmin, and the Brahmin does not prosper without the Kshatriya. So he's quoting from one of these sources, I think Alok Parashar's book or one of the other books, where he says that such rituals as of the golden cow, what is ritual of the golden cow? We'll see very soon. To invent these rituals and to control the Kshatriyas, where there were no such rituals in the original texts of Hinduism. So he says the Brahmins essentially invented all kinds of weird rituals just to keep a stranglehold, particularly on the Kshatriya community, because the Kshatriya community was their milch cow. So their entire earnings and their livelihood and their influence in society depended on their controlling this Kshatriya community. So there was a collusion between the Kshatriyas and the Brahmins, and the Brahmins invented these rituals to keep them under fear of various kinds of psychological insecurities, and this is how the Brahmins secured their place at the top of this social hierarchy in Hinduism. And if you look at it, the whole portrayal of the Brahmin community, whether it is in the introduction or in the later part of the book, is very unfortunate, very sad, because it is a very biased picture of the Brahmin community that comes out, almost bordering on the offensive, in fact, almost bordering on insulting them. So you see the kind of language that he has used, or the kind of texts which he has selectively quoted to portray this negative image of the Brahmin community, where he says one Buddhist text ranks dogs above Brahmins, actually because Buddhism was a competitor, and to use this to support his whole, the theory that he is building. The British imperialism in India also saw the rise of a Brahmin collaborator class. So he's accusing the Brahmins of having collaborated with the British, and that they were in collusion with the British, and they were aiding the colonizers, and they were serving the colonizers. And yet, in the same tone, on page 118, he says this, and look at what he's saying on page 120, that Company Raj also enabled a Brahmin Raj. That the Brahmins, looked at the way the British were controlling India, and therefore became promoters of nationalism so that they could control India. So on the one hand, he is saying that the Brahmins were colluding with the British, that they were the collaborator class. On the other hand, he is contradicting himself by saying that the Brahmins became the leading promoters of nationalism in India, which was hostile to the British. So the ritual of the golden cow, which I was referring to in the previous slide, look at the kind of mention that he makes of the Maharaja of Tanjore. He says that a weird ritual was invented where the Raja would have to get into a golden cow, or that he would have to sit on the lap of the priest's wife, and that these are the kind of weird rituals that were done by the Brahmins to keep the Kshatriyas under their control. So, this whole portrayal of Hinduism as merely a Brahminical construct invented by the Brahmins out of their imagination and simply to control the rest of the sections in the society. So we find this to be very, very problematic, not true at all, very, very biased, and one-sided kind of completely promoting the colonial history versions of history that he was relying on in writing this introduction. So we are contrasting this with other historians, like for example, Dr. Meenakshi Jain, if you look at her articles, look at the picture of the Brahmin community that she is projecting, one of the leading sociologists, historians. In fact, if you were watching today's news, would have heard that she has been nominated to the Rajya Sabha and the Prime Minister was congratulating her. I think one historian who deserves the epithet of being a public historian today is Dr. Meenakshi Jain, because she is engaged with the public, whether it was the Ram Janmabhoomi movement like Sitaram Goel did. She has continued that legacy and brought the real history of whether it is Ayodhya, whether it is Kashi, whether it is our education system. And she says that the early British administrators had a great respect for Indian society and culture. They were admirers, in fact. But the situation changes when they became our masters, so their whole attitude changed, and the superiority complex and this, looking down upon Hinduism and the Indians started once they took political control. This nuance, which Dr. Meenakshi Jain brings out in her writings, in her history, is completely lacking, is completely missing in Manu Pillai's book, because he's kind of fixated on this idea which he's trying to project, that the Britishers, the Hinduism that the Britishers saw when they came to India was a kind of a very exotic, weird Hinduism invented by the Brahmins. That it was not the original Hinduism which existed in the pre-British era, and therefore the British reacted. The missionaries, etc., used this exotic, weird, ritualistic Brahminical Hinduism, and they were, considered this to be kind of the dark ages in India, that people were living in superstition and this kind of thing. And therefore, they brought in modern education, they brought in Christianity to reform us. And this was the positive side effect of the colonial rule in India, that it reformed Hinduism. It made Hinduism better, and it removed this Brahminical control. It allowed the subaltern classes in India to assert themselves and to create their own narratives of Hinduism. So, this is basically what he tries to say. So look at what Dr. Meenakshi Jain says, that the British were not wrong in their distrust of educated Brahmins in whom they saw a potential threat to their supremacy in India. For instance, in 1879, the collector of Tanjore, in a communication to Sir James Caird, a member of the Famine Commission, stated that there was no class except Brahmins which was so hostile to the English. The predominance of the Brahmins in the freedom movement confirmed the worst British suspicions of the community. Innumerable CID reports of the period commented on Brahmin participation at all levels of the nationalist movement. In the words of an observer, if any community could claim credit for driving the British out of the country, it was the Brahmin community. 70% of those who were felled by British bullets were Brahmin. So you have a completely different picture of the Brahmin community and their role in the freedom movement that Dr. Meenakshi Jain is saying. So we'll leave it to the readers to contrast this with the one-sided portrayal of the author in his book. When you read the book, please keep this bias in mind. So he comes up, as I said, based on these sources, which he is relying upon largely on authors like Romila Thapar or Aloka Parashar, etc. He comes up with this theory in the introduction where he says that the Brahmins branded most of India as Mlecha Desha. Something so shocking, I mean, so weird, because nowhere else I have ever come across theory like this in the readings of Indian history, that the large tracts of India were considered as Mlecha. He says most of present-day India tellingly was branded Mlecha or barbarian country, including Gujarat, Sindh in the west, Bengal and Bihar in the east, and the southern peninsula. To visit these places was to commit sin through the feet. So this is what he says in the introduction, and therefore, in our refutal of this, we have quoted just one, important shloka from the Vishnu Purana, which is at least about the 8th century BCE, if I am, if my date is correct, where it has this famous shloka, the land mass between the Himalayas and the ocean, Uttare Himalayascha, and Samudra in the south. Bharati Atra Santati, Bharatam Tat Nama, that this land is called Bharata, and the people living here are Bharatiyas. So when you go to the source texts of Hinduism, whether it is the Vedas with the Nadis, Stuti Sukta, etc., listing out so many rivers, and the entire geography of India is in fact considered sacred the whole of Bharatavarsha is sacred to us, whether it is in the Vedas or in the Puranas or in the Itihasas. But this theory, absolutely has no basis at all. So the whole of the introduction, you see, is based on this kind of wild conjectures, which he has picked up from, kind of second-hand sources, interpretations, and colonial historiography. So this is the next point that we are showing is something which we have pointed out in a review of Dalrymple's book also, that many of these historians try to drive a wedge between wherever they find fault lines, right? So this has been Marxist historiography. You always have to find the oppressor and the oppressed. So the upper class is always the oppressor, the lower classes are the oppressed. And kind of Buddhism is the liberator, Buddhism is the emancipator, and Hinduism is the oppressor. Or Vedic Hinduism and Puranic Hinduism, even there they will drive a wedge, saying that Puranic Hinduism is something which the Brahmins have invented, and Vedic Hinduism was kind of more, egalitarian. All kinds of theories, wherever they are able to find, even a thin line which they can use to divide society, is what you find exaggerated to such an extent. So this is a theory that he relies on to a great extent, that Vedic Hinduism and Puranic Hinduism are at loggerheads with each other. So he says old gods of the Vedic age, such as Indra and Agni, made way for two powerful deities, Vishnu and Shiva, in their own mythologies and strategies to counter Shramanic ambition. So he says, it was only to counter the Jaina, Shramanas, etc., that a new mythology or new deities were projected to be central to Hinduism, that in Vedic Hinduism, Vishnu, Shiva, etc., had no place at all. Right. So this is his theory. He also, in fact, devalues the Puranas to a great extent, and the Sanskrit sources, saying that a set of Sanskrit books was almost mechanically construed as the authentic core of a shambolic religious system. And then look at the way he has devalued the Skanda Purana. This is based on this is Wendy Doniger's quote, where he says that the Skanda Purana has even been described as a scrap bag, that it's something, the Skanda Purana, in fact, is one of the largest and also very important of the 18 Puranas. And even this Devi Mahatmya, the Durga Saptashati, etc., I think comes in the Skanda Purana, if I am right. I think Probal will know better, being a Shakta, right? So to reduce this Skanda Purana to a scrap bag, and to quote Wendy Doniger's estimation of this, is again we find something to be unacceptable. Therefore, as a challenge to that, we have pointed out that most of the scholars of Hinduism, those who were rooted, those who were practicing Hindus, they never found this wedge or this dichotomy between what the author calls Vedic, Hinduism, Vedic religion, and the later Puranic religion. So, a very important example that we have quoted is Sri Aurobindo from the Essays on the Gita, where he says the Vishnu of the Veda, with his wide strides measuring out the worlds, is the same high-seated and deep-hearted divine being who, in later times, assumes the forms of Rama and Krishna to preserve the Dharma. So Sri Aurobindo is connecting the Veda to the Vedic religion, to the Itihasas, to the Ramayana, to the Mahabharata, and to the later Puranas. So, he does not find this kind of a dichotomy. So then he says that the Vedas are primarily restricted to Brahmins, that it is just a restricted Brahmin concern, and the popular masses, in fact, never bothered to learn the Vedas, nor they were allowed to learn the Vedas. So the Vedas never had any influence on the masses in India, right? So we have again challenged this argument which Manu Pillai is bringing by pointing out that, in fact, most of the daily rituals of practicing Hindus involve hymns and mantras from the Vedas, including the Sandhya Vandana, which all the Trivarnas are supposed to do, right? Contain hymns from the Vedas. And in fact, in all the temples, the Shodashopachara Puja, which is done in the temples, whether it is in the morning or the afternoon or the evening, will compulsorily involve chanting of hymns from the Rig Veda, from the Yajur Veda, from the Sama Veda, etc. The 16 samskaras which every Hindu is supposed to go through, all the Varnas are supposed to go through this, from, let's say the Namakarana to the death rituals, contain hymns from the Vedas. And therefore, to say that the Vedas were primarily only a Brahminical concern, and that the masses had no contact, or the Vedas had no influence on the masses, etc., is completely an inaccurate, again, colonial kind of argument which he is peddling through his introduction of Hinduism. So this is till here was only the introduction, this 34-page introduction that we were dealing with. So most of these models that he uses, the historical kind of structures that he uses to build this introduction of Hinduism, as you can see, is largely based on colonial historiography of Hinduism. So we now come to the second chapter, which is in fact the most problematic chapter, which is called Monsters and Missionaries. So here in this second chapter, he is trying to build this argument that when the early missionaries, Christian missionaries came to India, when what the rituals and the customs and the practices which they saw of Hinduism reminded them of the pre-Christian pagan religions in Europe, and they connected this Hinduism, the living religion, the practicing religion that was extant in India then, to these practices of the pagans, etc. And they found it to be abhorring. And to to build this argument, the picture of Hinduism that he projects is so vulgar, in fact, is so problematic, and again very one-sided, right? So this is something like the kind of coverage that we would see in the mainstream media, for example, of the Kumbh Mela. 20 years ago, if you would pick up a newspaper like the Times of India during the Kumbh Mela, so this is typically the kind of reporting that you would see, that they would go and take a picture of a Naga sadhu sitting naked on the banks of the Prayag, etc., smoking a chillam, and then they would go around, tell the whole world that this is Hinduism for you. And this is exactly what Manu Pillai is doing in his book, in the second chapter on monsters and missionaries. Look at the kind of language or the kind of picture of Hinduism that he is painting to the modern Indians through his book. That Indians were lecherous. So he's quoting some foreign scholar who says that Indian women were lecherous and inconstant, and they disposed of their men to have better means to fulfill their lusts. So, of course, he does say that these were exaggerations, or that many of these early missionaries misunderstood Hinduism to a great extent. But the point that we fail to understand is what is he trying? Why is he lending legitimacy to this kind of biased, very exotic kind of picture of Hinduism that is painted by these British missionaries, something like what Catherine Mayo did, whom Gandhi would call as a drain inspector. So essentially, Manu Pillai is doing this drain inspection of Hinduism, projecting this picture, exotic picture of Hinduism, and then he's setting up this straw man called, the Brahmin nationalists like Tilak and Savarkar, and that they were reacting to these missionary criticisms of the weird customs in Hinduism. And therefore, Hindutva, which is the violent, aggressive, modern Hindu identity, has been shaped by this kind of very problematic encounter between the Christian missionaries and the Brahmin nationalists. This is exactly, to put it in a concise way, this is the theory that he is trying to build. So look at this description of the sadhu that he is giving. I'll leave it to the readers to read it, because I find it very embarrassing even to read it out to your audience. So this is the kind of portrayal of our sadhus and sannyasis that Manu Pillai brings out in his book. And then he glorifies one of the most cunning Christian missionaries who lived in India. Right? This is Roberto di Nobili, as he was called, right? Who settled in Madurai and dressed up like a sannyasi, etc. So he's justifying this acculturation by saying that the early Christian missionaries did a mistake by being so harsh in their judgment of Hinduism, and that they did not adopt the proper means to reform Hinduism, or to bring, to interact with Hinduism. And therefore, Robert Lee Nobili takes a more nuanced approach. And what is the nuanced approach? That he gave up the Christian cassock and adopted the ochre robe of the sannyasin, and that by doing so, by taking on the appearance of being a Hindu, and by adopting Hindu customs, practices, etc., he went into the bad books of the Orthodox missionaries who were coming from Europe, but he actually opened up, the doors for the real reformation of Hinduism by doing this. through this acculturation that he was really able to make inroads into India and to bring modern Christian influence to the Hindus. And therefore, he says sannyasam or renunciation is a normative goal for Orthodox Hindus. Assuming the look of an ascetic Brahmin, the Catholic father exalted here an ideal straight out of Sanskrit. So he's almost eulogizing Robert De Nobili for having adopted a more nuanced approach, a very intelligent approach to converting Hindus and to creating a Hinduized version of Christianity, which became popular, leading to reformations in Hinduism. Another very important point which we want your audience to take note of is Manu Pillai's views on Indian education. So basically, he says that one of the positive side effects of the British rule in India was that this Brahminical control kind of got diluted, and the subaltern, the masses, gained the power to assert themselves. And how did they do that? Through the great gift that Macaulay brought through the new English education system that was introduced through Macaulay's Minute in 1835. And therefore, that this English education became a tool for the emancipation of the masses. And therefore, he justifies that by coming up with this theory that when English education was introduced in India, it became so popular that even the Brahmins, started taking to English education wholeheartedly. They would pick up the Bible so that they could just master English, so that they could become modernized, etc. And therefore, that English education found great popularity in India. And he contradicts himself again, like in the earlier contradictions that we have said. If you look at the bottom paragraph, where he is quoting a Governor General, a British Governor General in the mid 1830s, who ordered that state funding hereon should be reserved only modern education in English, and that artificial patronage for Oriental learning be gradually withdrawn, and that Macaulay endorsed the move. So, on the one hand, he is saying that the new English education and the education system was so popular that even Brahmins were adopting to it. But on the other hand, he is giving us the real reason as to why indigenous education, was sidelined, or how it was wiped out. It was uprooted, as Gandhiji says in his famous, speech at the Chatham House, which was later on developed by Dharampal in his famous works on indigenous education in India. That systematically the sources of support, the ecosystem that existed, and the funding that was available to these indigenous schools was starved by the British, was dried up by the British, which they diverted to this new education in English medium, which they were doing. And this was the real reason why, in fact, that the traditional schools started disappearing. So again, we do not accept this theory of Manu Pillai that English education was somehow more popular than the traditional education, and that was the reason for the Brahmins taking to English education. In fact, what he leaves out is what we all know is Macaulay's what is called the downward filtration theory, where in fact for the first time in Indian history he introduced the reservations, caste-based reservations in the English system, particularly to target the upper caste and particularly the Brahmin community, because he knew that the Brahmin community was the intelligentsia of Hinduism, and therefore, if they could be converted, anglicized through this new education system, then the head and the brain, the intelligentsia of Hinduism would be destroyed. So this is in fact, the real reason why the Brahmins kind of fell for the trap. It is true, but it is not because of the popularity of the English education system. We do know that a lot of nationalist scholars like Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Gandhi, Ananda Kumaraswamy, and others, in fact, just a few decades after 1835, started, very strong, in no uncertain language. They criticized the new education system that had been introduced into India. Gandhiji called it as a de-Indianizing system of education, right? And Vivekananda would say that not a single original man in the three presidencies has been produced since the introduction of this new system of education. So, developing this thread, Manu Pillai goes on to paint a very rosy picture of Raja Ramohan Roy and Phule, the Phule couple, Jyotiba Phule, etc. In particular, because he says, he quotes the Pule couple, for example, as very good examples of how emancipation from the caste system was made possible by this Christianizing influence of the British. And he considers them as great social reformers, who brought in the ideals, egalitarian ideals from Europe, and emancipated these otherwise, the lower classes in Hinduism who were under the stranglehold of Brahminism in India. So he says, Roy argued that Hinduism's loftiest ideas concealed within the dark curtain of Sanskrit language never reached its beneficiaries thanks to Brahmin cunning. Krishna, he declared, committed unholy acts with women. Shiva's phallic icon was so indecent. So we do know that Raja Rammohn Roy was in fact the collaborator class, the same accusation which Manu Pillai is leveling against the Brahmin community. In fact, it is people like Raja Rammohn Roy who were the real collaborators of the British in India, right? And all this, argumentation which Manu Pillai is doing, why is he doing this? Because he is setting up people like Raja Rammohn Roy and the Phules as a contrast. These are the real reformist Hindus. These are the real egalitarian Hindus. These are the real peaceful Ahimsavadi Hindus. And they are the real ideals that we should follow in modern India, as against the aggressive Hindus like Swami Dayanand Saraswati of Arya Samaj, who wanted us to go back to the sources of Hinduism, to the Vedas, etc., and to Tilak and Savarkar. So Dayanand Saraswati, Tilak, and Savarkar are the three pet hates of Manu Pillai. Not surprisingly, because again, Brahmin nationalists, you see, and therefore this is his pet hate for this book, that they're responsible for this aggressive Hindutva identity, the modern Hindutva discourse. This whole Hindutva identity has been created by these Brahminical nationalists. So this is the argument that he is trying to project, and therefore you will find that the tone completely changes when Manu Pillai comes to the rise of Hindu nationalism, modern nationalism, and particularly to Tilak, to Savarkar. You will see that he adopts a very sarcastic or a caustic kind of a tone. In fact, if you read between the lines, you will see him gloating over the suffering of Savarkar, for example. He says that Savarkar died a failed man, a very frustrated man, and he's almost like gloating over it, because he's trying to say that these were the founding fathers of Hindutva, and therefore they got what they deserved. Right. So this is the kind of treatment that is reserved for Savarkar and Tilak in particular. So Tilak also, you will see a very one-sided portrayal of Tilak, where he, in his book, he concentrates only on, say, some of the orthodox social views that Tilak had, right? See, none of these people were, we're not saying that they were perfect in any way. Perhaps they had their own blind spots, right? So that is a mute argument. That is, we are not saying that they were perfect in any way. But yet, he is bringing out only these, the weakest links, right? So he will show only the most orthodox views on, for example, on women, on widow remarriage, or on the education of girl child that Tilak would have, which would look to a modern Hindu today, it would look very problematic. It would look very outdated. It would look kind of, very, not progressive, right? So this is the image of Tilak that he tries to protect, so that his real contribution to the nationalist movement that Tilak did. So these were the revolutionaries and these were the nationalists we all know, who were really responsible for inspiring whole generations of people who fought against the British. So he is trying to cut down that image by projecting a kind of one-sided image of Tilak, Savarkar, etc. So all the the conventional stereotypes about Savarkar are repeated in the book, that he was an apologist, that he writes this letter of apology, etc. That it is debated, etc. He does admit. But overall, the whole idea is that, Savarkar's understanding of Indian history was very poor. If you look at some of the writings that he did, that there are a lot of distortions in the Indian history that he has written, that he was not a trained historian or a scholar, that he produces a lot of ridiculous, in fact, history of India, and that the whole of Hindutva is based on such shoddy scholarship of people like Savarkar, and very conveniently they would invent lies where such lies did not exist in order to create this conception of a Hindu Rashtra, that Bharata was a Hindu Rashtra, etc. So this is what he says, that Savarkar naturally pervade the past, not as a scholar, but as an ideologue. And where the shared past, so essential to his formulation, did not exist, it was made to exist. History in his books, that is, appears not in its own context or on its own terms, but as raw fodder to support predetermined position. And so he would tell the story Hindus needed to hear to enthrone Hindutva and seize power. So this is the language that nationalists like Tilak and Savarkar seized power so that they could make Hindutva as the dominant discourse and that they could declare India as a Hindu Rashtra. So this is basically the essence of Manu Pillai's book, and these are the arguments, these are the narratives that he builds throughout his book. So, so if you look at the introduction, then the monsters and missionaries, and then the rise of Hindutva, these are the three important chains or threads that you find in Manu Pillai's book, right? So, in trying to build this theory that modern identity of Hinduism is a Brahminical construct, and this aggressive Hinduism that you are seeing today, the reaction to Ram Janmabhoomi, etc., is all born of this Brahminical Hinduism, and that this is not true Hinduism, and therefore, we have to go back to people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Phule, etc. They represent a different version of Hinduism, and these have been kind of sidelined or ignored by the Hindu nationalists, etc. They have been suppressed by Hindu nationalists. And in doing so, he is legitimizing, he's lending legitimacy to all the worst colonial stereotypes of Hinduism, which you find in the colonial historiography of India. So this is what we have tried to say. This is the gist of the review that we have, written about Manu Pillai. So we can have some question and answers if you want. Probal, if you want to add some points before we go for the question answer.
We have more or less covered everything in details. I personally don't have to add anything much at this stage, but if we have some questions, then we can address them.
Thanks, Probal ji. Thanks, Pramod ji. That's a very insightful and eye-opening critique of Manu Pillai's book. Let me go back to the question that I asked at the beginning of the session when we joined. What is the demographic this book is speaking to? Because the subtitle of the book reads The Making of Modern Hindu Identity. So do we have a modern Hindu identity already that this book is, modern Hindu demographic that this book is speaking to? If so, then how to influence that section to actually, come over or cross over to the other side?
So basically, the book is addressed to the English elite of Hinduism, right, and to all the English-educated intellectuals in India, and it is providing fodder, in fact, for the critics of Hinduism, for all the enemies of Hinduism, to beat us with a stick by exaggerating and projecting all the fault lines of Hinduism and the weaknesses of Hinduism. And therefore, the antidote to that should be that we should go back to the sources, right? To critique scholars like this, all we have to do is go to the original sources, to the texts, and we will find a completely different picture from what is being projected here, right? So even if you look at this argument of social emancipation, etc., right? So what Manu Pillai is not telling the audience is that perhaps amongst all the world religions, if there is one religion which has constantly strived for social reform from within, and not simply because of pressure from without, it is Hinduism. Right? Most of the reformers, in fact, in Hinduism, have also come from the Brahmin community. Right? So whether it is Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, for example, who would go and clean the toilet of a pariah, right? Just to overcome his ego, or you would say, or the sense of superiority of being a Brahmin, etc. Right? So he's hiding this fact that Hinduism has had a very, very organic evolution and a process of reform, right, which is completely missing in most of the world religions. He's also not telling his audience that, this whole argument which he is building, that the caste system and that the social hierarchy is unique to Hinduism, is a completely inaccurate, wrong argument. And you will see that most of the world religions and societies abroad, including China, for example, had similar social stratifications. Right, this stratification had nothing to do uniquely with Hinduism. That such social hierarchies are a product of human evolution, of social evolution, and to particularly to blame only Hinduism for it, or to say that this phenomenon is only unique to Hinduism, to have a social hierarchy like this, is a completely historically, factually inaccurate argument. So these are the facts that we should take to the public if we want to counter authors like Manu.
Great, great. Thanks for that. Let's open up to any questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and speak. Yes, Somnaji.
Namaste. Thank you so much for this. I was wondering if you could comment on factors that led to the British leaving India and the influence of people like Bose and the Indian National Army. And of course, the naval, they call it the mutiny, but it is the rebellion in Bombay in 1946, in combination, of course, with later on with the direct action, which happened in Calcutta in 1946. That's my question.
Okay. See, this is not primarily the focus of. Go ahead, Probal. You please make your.
Yeah, I was just saying that this is not the focus of this review, but I'll just give our point of view to this. The Indian independence movement was definitely not a one-man show, or is definitely not what we are made to read up today in post-independent India. It was definitely, to be very open about it, it was definitely not a Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress show alone. There were other serious players, if I can put it that way. There were other serious players in the chessboard of scheme of things who were making great sacrifices at great personal inconvenience, and even at sacrificing their lives to secure the freedom. But somehow after India's independence, the writing of history took a turn that everything else became footnotes, and it became kind of a one-man, one-party, one-family show. Now, coming to it, there is this reference to Clement Attlee, the former Labour Prime Minister of England, visiting India post-independence, staying at Raj Bhavan in Kolkata, and in a private discussion with the then governor, he seems to have commented that Gandhi and the Indian National Congress had minimal role to play for the British deciding to leave India in 1947. So he was, in fact, in charge of the British government when it was decided that India should become free. But there were definitely a couple of reasons. One reason was definitely the British Empire losing its shin in the Second World War, kind of liquidating itself of all its resources, fighting the war, and becoming incapable of managing an empire or moving forward with an empire henceforward. The second was Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's Indian National Army or Azad Hind Fauj had driven a deep wedge in the regular British Indian Army, and the British were afraid of how the Indian soldiers would be considering their allegiance henceforward. And the naval mutiny, the rebellion in Bombay, which is severely downplayed, had its own share. In fact, you'd know how the role of Azad Hind Fauj was that post-independence a circular was issued that Netaji's photograph should not be placed in the barracks of the Indian National Army, and the regulars of Azad Hind Fauj were not co-opted back in the regular post-independent National Army. I think this kind of answers you, sir. And obviously, Gandhi did refer to Catherine Mayo's book as the Drain Inspector's Report because of its negative portrayal of India.
I think for those of you who are interested in this thread, Sanjeev Sanyal's Revolutionaries, I think, would be a very interesting read for all of you. Where he covers all these, the revolutionaries' contribution to Indian history. And in fact, Somnaji has made an important point in the comments. If you see, he has mentioned that Manu Pillai's book is a copy of Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. In fact, we wanted to cover this aspect in the review, but as I said earlier, our review had gone so long, running into 7,000 words, that we did not have the place for it. But he makes a very important point here, and there's something to think about. That this is not something original. This whole model or historiography that Manu Pillai is doing, it is based on a similar book by this title called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which was tried out elsewhere.
Thank you. We have a question from Suresh Grevalji, and then we'll go to Lakshmi Narayanaji and Shwetji. So Sureshji says most of the acclaimed Indian historians, barring a few, are a product of the British system, and the system has gone from bad to worse post-independence. We need to focus on educating the administrators and the professors to bring the desired change. Being a member of the IKS group, what are your recommendations to the government? I think it's a wider question. Probably you can pick up the topmost.
I think we did touch upon this a little last time also during the Dharmic
exactly.
review. I think there was a similar question that came. See, the main challenge is that while the other camp is producing books and books, we are producing reviews and reviews. So this has to change if we want to, tilt the narrative, right? Our camp has to come up with more literature, original literature and original research. For this, there has to be a supportive ecosystem, right, which needs to be created. And thankfully, the process has started, though it is still very slow and feeble, right? The change is not perhaps as fast as we would want it to be, but definitely the winds of change are definitely visible. The sprouts of change are definitely visible. And in this whole effort that this government is doing through the National New Education Policy 2020 and the rewriting of the textbooks, so definitely, this shift is happening. There is a paradigm shift that is happening, and we are all privileged. We are blessed to be part of that effort wherever possible. In fact, this is what we have been trying to recommend to the government, or to ensure that the true history of India and India's contributions to knowledge should be included in the textbooks wherever possible. So this is also happening. Again, not as much as perhaps we would be happy with, but definitely there is a shift that is happening.
Just an associated, Just an associated question before we move on to the other questions. Is it because writing social commentaries is essentially a Western concept, and we are only reacting to it? Whereas, do you have, or is there an Indian tradition of writing social commentaries which we can bring up?
See, one of my academic mentors would give a very interesting example. He would say it's like the Western academia has constructed a multi-story building, and what you're doing is trying to change a screw in it. Right? So the whole rules of the game are already set. You are playing in a domain which is created, in fact, to favor them. Right? So, and therefore you appear to be constantly reacting to it. So that is why this paradigm shift of having an IKS approach, an Indian knowledge systems approach to knowledge itself, is so very critical to bring about the change, so that it is not just in content. We are not simply correcting the distortions, factual distortions, or in the content, but our very approach to contributing to knowledge, to building new knowledge, should change. Right. So that is why the IKS approach is so very important.
Thank you. Lakshmi Narayan Rao garu, you can go ahead.
Namaste, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you for inviting me for this. First of all, there is a very good news. I don't know whether you know about it or not. Mrs. Meenakshi Jain is now nominated to Indian Rajya Sabha.
Yes, yes.
So it is a major recognition for the narrative battle and her contribution to that. And she has extensively written on Raja Ram Mohan Rai and Sati Prada and all those things, which we just discussed. I just to add to what Mr. Chowdhury said, what has happened, two important things happened in the Second World War. First of all, the invincibility of the white man was crushed by Japanese, so that the mental block that the white men are some sort of a superior thing who cannot be defeated was gone. The second one is the recruitment, massive recruitment that has taken place in the Indian Army started bringing people who are otherwise not will not be recruited into Indian Army because of their social greater educational thing and greater political awareness and all that. So the Indian Army and the British Indian Army that fought in the Second World War was far more educated, far more exposed to the atrocities of the British, and wo namak ka ye jo ada karna hai, all those things were not there. So they faced a serious sort of an armed force, which is not like an earlier armed force, British Army, which is one of their pillars of strength within because basically the army, British Army before the Second World War, with due respect, is a mercenary army. But that is not the case after the Second World War. And it got out of the mental block. With regard to the Indian narrative battle, what I've observed is that the first wave of narrative has come from Ambedkarites, which basically I live in India. So extensively, at least in Telugu states, the Ambedkarites together with Christians started a sort of a massive anti-Hindu narrative battle and all that. And slowly the Pule thing has started coming for the last 10 years. Particularly a sort of a BC political movement has started, and that Pule batch has also come. So these two things are extensively going on, and that narrative battle is quite prevalent in as on today. We are doing it, but that is happening now. Thank you.
Valid points.
Thanks.
In fact, since you mentioned Dr. Meenakshi Jain, I think perhaps you joined late, but I did mention at the beginning that about Dr. Meenakshi Jain being a fit case for being called a public historian in India, right? And the kind of cancel culture that historians like her have faced. Imagine somebody like Romila Thapar getting international awards. But all her life, Dr. Meenakshi Jain had to face so much of this pressure from the ecosystem, right? In fact, she should have been an internationally recognized historian today for the kind of contributions that she has made to Indian history. But this is what our historians have suffered because of the whole system, being under the stranglehold of the Marxist historians since independence.
Shwet, could you ask your question? I don't know.
Yeah. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, guys. I mean, it was really, really worthwhile joining this. Just wanted to add a point on your point of structural hierarchy in the society being not unique to Indian society. It's been seen in other societies. But what I wanted to add was um, they are not the exact same. So the level of sophistication that we built in the structure over years is different. So I think in most cases, the structural hierarchy was created to kind of create a stranglehold for certain individuals for that role. Whereas in Indian society, I would kind of argue that this is primarily to optimize or maximize the human potential. So if you look at the way we design these structures, so for Brahmins, for Vaishyas, for the Sudras, for so many other even subclasses within this, the medical practitioners, what they eat, what they wore, how they live their lifestyle. I think all of that kind of points to an effort on the part of whoever designed it, or maybe it was evolved over centuries. I don't know. Um, there is a clear focus on maximizing the performance of individuals and, as such, the society as a whole. Whereas you don't see that in analog comparison in the Western societies. I think that needs to be. I haven't heard that argument enough in any of this discussion, but I think that's a very salient point. At some point, of course, it became genetic, hereditary, which is obviously sad because that led to more suboptimal outcomes later on. But the original intent, in my opinion, was different. And I think that point needs to come out in this discussion. So, uh, Pramod, do you have any thoughts on this? I'm sorry, I don't say G as much because of my because I stay abroad. That kind of slipped up. So sorry about that. But generally, any thoughts on this aspect?
I do agree with you. In fact, it is a very important point that you bring up. So if you look at the Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, so Moksha being the choiceless choice, the ultimate goal for all human beings. So emancipation, liberation was definitely, the goal for all Hindus, and the very foundation of Hindu philosophy itself, as you say. So the whole idea was to emancipate individuals, to strive for liberation, right? And the second point that you made, one is the Purushartha part. The second is I forget that in the social structure itself, yes, so, upward mobility of the caste hierarchy is something again that Manu Pillai, very carefully does not touch upon, right? So, in the pre-British period, we all know today, this is a historically established fact, that it is because of colonial interference that the caste system became more rigid, because in their attempt to, in fact, bring large tracts of India under British control, and when they found that Indian society was too complex and too diverse for them to understand, right? A more kind of a monolithic system would be easier for them to control. And therefore, the British, in fact, fossilized many of these social hierarchies through their interference, which was not the case in the pre colonial period. And therefore, upward mobility was encouraged through the Jati Varna system, right? Even through marriages, for example, the Mahabharata talks about Anuloma and Viloma, that marriages where if a girl from the lower caste could marry a person from the higher caste, because post marriage, the children would then be elevated to the higher varna. So, such marriages were encouraged. In fact, such intercaste marriages were encouraged. So, the whole idea was that we would go towards the upward mobility with moksha as the idea. So, I do agree with the points.
Just a point. I don't truly agree with this concept of higher and lower caste, to be honest. I think that was probably not what the intention was. So when you say a lower caste moving to higher caste, I think the the distinction of the caste or the strata in the society was designed, as I said, and I kind of keep repeating that in many forums as well, is for a completely different purpose. I agree that ultimately moksha was the aim, and gradually move individuals towards that was probably the long-term goal of that. It's kind of similar to what the Buddhist philosophy follows over lifetimes of through work, through penance, through meditation. But I think the idea was to create individuals who are more capable and as such benefit the society as a whole. So the way the food of Kshatriyas was designed, the food of Brahmins was designed, how much protein they had to, how many meals they had to have every day, the kind of clothes they will wear. I think that level of sophistication is unheard of. I haven't seen any analog of that anywhere else in any other structure that I've read about. Now, it's normal.
Difficulty is that
Yeah.
see, when we're critiquing colonial historiography or authors like Manu Pillai who are peddling those narratives,
Mhm.
so we are forced to use the same terminology when we are critiquing it. So therefore, I was using this
Right.
higher and lower, not in the intention that there was a vertical hierarchy. We do know that this hierarchy was not vertical. It's best explained in the symbolism of Ananta Padmanabha, right? Vishnu
Mhm.
reclining. So when the Rigveda talks about Purusha Sukta, the Purusha that is in the imagination or in the vision of the Vedic rishis is the reclining Purusha. He is not the vertical Purusha with the Shudras coming out of the feet. And therefore, they are at the bottom of the society, but it is the reclining Purusha. And therefore, even today, when you go to a Vishnu temple, right, it is the feet. In Indian tradition, it is always the feet that have more sanctity. Right?
Mhm.
The priest will ask you in Tamil, Tiruvadi Sevai, Mudichacha, he will say, have you had darshan of the feet of the Lord? He will not say, have you had darshan of the face of the Lord? Right? So,
Mhm.
as you say, the hierarchy is, there's higher social, again, terms which the colonial historiographers have used, and it's only because we're critiquing it, so therefore we are pointing out that even if you take it as a vertical hierarchy, the goal was always towards rising towards moksha, towards a knowledge hierarchy, right? It was not merely a controlled hierarchy, but it was towards knowledge that we were heading towards.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I was referring more back to your point around the IKAS and the fact that you're right. We have a structure that we are trying to fit into. It's like a square peg in a round hole, and which is why it's difficult for us to kind of push through. But I think these are the terminologies which, in a way, reinforces their point or their views of how the Indian society structure was at that time. And I think this is why I'm trying to kind of move away from the narrative in order to kind of not only just contradict them at their points, but also kind of create a separate counter narrative around a very different logic structure altogether. But anyways, I think this discussion itself is a long one, and I have lots of thoughts on that. But I'll let go because there are other people waiting in queue to discuss this specific point. But thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you. Well, Jati Varna itself is a very wide topic and certainly doesn't fit in the context
Indeed.
of this book review. And we can have a separate session on that if that's worth it.
Indeed.
Vishwajit ji, please go ahead with your question.
I actually wanted to know is that in Savarkar's writings, that is Six Glorious Epochs, he has mentioned about Buddhism and its impact on untouchability. Okay, so when it comes to Buddhism and untouchability, and the fact that I think even Sankaran Sanuji and Rakesh Sinha Krishna, they have mentioned in their tweets, etc., that Buddhism, when it traveled to China or Korea, there was the untouchability which it carried with. So this aspect is never highlighted. It is always Brahmanism which is highlighted, whereas the Buddhist aspect is probably never even mentioned. So are there any other sources which we can go to check whether how much Buddhism had its influence when it comes to untouchability? Thank you.
Yes, a valid point again. I agree with you. In fact, this vegetarianism, which was projected as a moral ideal, right, led to a whole section of non-vegetarian Hindus in India being kind of devalued or being treated in a discriminatory way. This happens with the rise of largely because of the popularity of vegetarianism within ahimsa, the rigid insistence on ahimsa within Buddhism and Jainism. And therefore, in fact, from the period of the rise of Buddhism, you do see, the fossilization of these social hierarchies becoming more rigid, more discriminatory, in fact, with the rise of Buddhism and Jainism. For sources, I think Arvind Neelakantan, whose book I have quoted in one of the slides, Dharmic Social History of India, I think he does a very elaborate study of this aspect of Buddhism and the influence that it had in actually, creating a rigid social structure in India. So you could perhaps look up that to start with. Any other sources, perhaps Probal could suggest?
Sir, there is a YouTube presentation by one Mr. Misra who has examined the same caste rigidity within the Buddhist structure. He says that when there were discussions among the Buddhist gods or something like that, they say that the Bodhisattva has said that whatever caste, whether Brahmins are dominate, then Buddha will born in Brahmin, like Bodhisattva, all those things were there. And there was a sutras are also there wherein the caste system, there is no upward mobility as such during the lifetime, and it is always fixed at the birth. So the today's what structure which we are seeing is basically the Buddhist idea of the caste structure without no upward mobility during lifetime, birth-based one. This was, I think, it basically came from the Buddhism, and unfortunately, there was not much study on the Buddhism and the social or how it affected the caste structure and all that. That is also one aspect which should be studied, because always these Buddhism leftist ideologues will take the help of the Buddhist, and it is some sort of a great thing happened and all those things. So this study also we require to do. Thank you.
Lakshmi Narayan, in fact, I forgot to touch upon, you had mentioned particularly this narrative battle that is happening with Pillai. Right? In fact, there's something important we saw in Maharashtra, for example, when a very young public historian, again, a popular historian on social media, True Indology, exposed the kind of the conversion angle related to the Pullais. We know the kind of reaction that it led to in Maharashtra, and he was forced to delete those posts. And in fact, the chief minister of Maharashtra was BJP chief minister, in fact, threatened him with very strict action for those posts. So, we are living even under this dispensation. You see, it's sometimes very difficult to, these myths have been so ingrained in the public mindset, in the popular literature, and they have been politicized so much. There are whole political careers that are built on these narratives and these structures. That to talk about the alternative truths that are there, it involves a lot of risk for the historians of our camp. So this is something that I wanted to mention in your previous question, but it just
So unfortunate.
My one. The increase of the Pule name, and actually first time I heard the Pule name is in 2019 elections, when Chiranjeevi and other people started taking in Andhra Pradesh. And that name continued and all that, it still continues. This is the first time to inject the Pule into Telugu society. And as far as the Maharashtrian background is concerned, there is a sort of a sublime undercurrent of hatred towards quote unquote so-called Brahmical idea. It comes both from Ambedkarites, neo-Buddhists, and also followers of the Pule. Because I also lived for up to 2022, for 10 years I lived in Bombay, and earlier also in Maharashtra. These two currents are there in Maharashtra also, almost on par with Tamil Nadu. This we can see that.
That's unfortunate, sir. I think that's the bane of electoral politics and the system that we have inherited from post-independence. There's a lot that needs to be undone, and there's strong forces opposing all that. For example, coming to Buddhism, I think there are clear literature from the earliest sources of Buddhism where Buddha supported caste. In fact, he chided people who are doing intercaste marriages at that time. So, but all that won't come to light because there's strong political cabal against it. Anyway, that
the
falls.
whole
Sorry.
Marxist discourse in Maharashtra, has very effectively propped up characters and icons like Pillai. For decades, they have done that, and we are reaping the fruits of that now. What we are seeing today is a result of that. So the counter to that, the antidote to that again would be to highlight, many other social reformers who were there at the grassroots in Hinduism, like Narayana Guru in Kerala, for example, right? Who's a very, very shining example of a reformer who was still rooted in the Hindu ethos, right? Who did not turn hostile to Hinduism while seeking to, say, address some of the discriminatory practices of what were perceived as, etc. So this is something very important that we should do. That many of these icons like Narayana Guru need to be highlighted, in the kind of reform, the kind of change, the kind of positive effect that they had at the grassroots of society needs to be highlighted in our history books.
Great. If we have any more questions, maybe one last question before we wind up the session. I think there's a lot of questions on Jati Varna and Buddhism, etc., which fall outside the scope of this book review. But I think we'll certainly have both the speakers again sometime to address these particularly. So thanks all for joining. Thanks Probal ji, thanks Pramod ji for this wonderful session. And